Kata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. All right, so tonight, chapter 37. This is the second part of the Assyrian assault, and actually what happens is there is no assault. But anyway, it's the buildup of the army around Judah and all throughout Judah, and then we're going to look into Hezekiah's prayer. So here we are in the historical interlude part there, and as far as time frame, still right in this 701 time frame right there. Okay, and then we'll see how things progress in history in later chapters. But I'm looking forward to getting into the more of the later chapters of Isaiah, because that's where it just really gets fascinating, talking about the Messiah and so forth. So anyway, I haven't moved my timeline here. We're still right there. So nothing new there. All right. Any questions or comments before we get started here? Okay. Let's begin with verse 1 then. When King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of Adonai. Okay, so what did he hear? If you look at that, that is what sackcloth looks like, okay? And in Texas, we just call that burlap. So they basically put on a burlap bag kind of clothes. You can imagine how scratchy that would be. All right, so that's what sackcloth is. It's just a rough weave clothing, and they would wear that. And so tearing the cloth, he tore his clothes, and that's a sign of extreme grief. And what happened is that, if you remember from last week, the Sennacherib, the king or the emperor of Assyria, he was raiding all around Judah, and I'll get to you in a second, Carmen. And then he sent a delegation to Jerusalem to try to get them to just go ahead and surrender, so they wouldn't have to go through all of the stuff of a siege and all that kind of thing. So that's they went there and just gave Jerusalem an ultimatum, and so that's where Hezekiah heard it. He tore his clothes and so forth. So yeah, Carmen, go ahead.
So did they when I was reading that earlier, I thought it was like they just tore their clothes, but then they put that burlap over their clothes, but they didn't. They
they took off. They would tear their clothes a little bit. Okay, they didn't rip their clothes off. They would rip it, tear it a little bit, because that was a sign of grief. And then they would take that off and put this burlap on right next to their skin. Otherwise, I mean, that's really a show of how much grief and mourning and repentance and all that you're displaying there, because you've got this burlap breeches, and so
right. Okay. All right. Thank you.
It would not have been very comfortable, that's for sure. But Hezekiah, to his credit, when he heard all about this, and he was going to be in mourning or whatever that was going to be, he went from the palace right to the temple. Now, the temple is a public place. I mean, there are lots of people that would be there, and so he is acknowledging before the country that we are in trouble here, folks, and I'm grieving, I'm mourning. Things are not good. No longer can we just pretend that we're going to get out of this all in one piece. So he goes to the temple, and we really don't know how active Hezekiah had been in making a treaty with Egypt, but his personal repentance and going to the temple, that kind of set the tone for the entire nation. And verse 2, he said, then he said, Eliakim, who is in charge of the palace, Shebna the scribe, and the senior Kohanim. Now, when it says the senior Kohanim, I don't know if that meant the Kohen Hagadol, the high priest, or something like that. But anyway, he said he sent them covered with sackcloth. So they're also wearing sackcloth now. And they sent him to Isaiah the prophet, son of Amos. All right, so Hezekiah sent some of his, and I guess some of his highest ranking officials within his government. He's got the guy that's in charge of the palace, and that would have maybe been his prime minister or something like that. And then his scribe there, that was the guy that wrote everything, that actually wrote the history. And then you had the leading priest. Now, whether that was, the high priest or just some of the priests that, the more senior priests that were within the temple, because they had a hierarchy within the temple, and they would have had a Beit Din, which was a seat of judgment, like we'd call it the Sanhedrin or Sanhedrin. But there would have been a few priests who were advisors to the high priest and also to the government. And so he sent this delegation to Isaiah's house. And it's noteworthy to know that he sent them to Isaiah's house rather than sending somebody and say, Isaiah, the king wants to see you. And because that would have been disrespectful to Isaiah, and Hezekiah definitely wanted to show respect for God's voice, God's prophet in Judah. So he reflected, he had that respect for Isaiah. So then this is the message that they delivered then to Hezekiah. Then they said to him, thus says Hezekiah, this day is a day of distress, rebuke, and contempt. For children have come to the point of birth, and there is no strength for giving birth. Perhaps Adonai, your God, will hear the words of Rabshakeh, and whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to mock the living God, and will rebuke the words which Adonai, your God, has heard. So offer prayer for the remnant that is left. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. The leaders of Judah, they're speaking for Hezekiah now, and they have basically acknowledged that Hezekiah he's come to the end of his rope. The Assyrian invasion of Judah is likened to, say, a woman who is in labor, having labor pains, and now she gets all the way to, still having labor, and the baby is not born. It's breech born or backwards or somehow. And so, or maybe the baby is ready to be born, but she is just out of strength. No more strength left. She can't push. She can't do the things that women who are birthing a child need to do to deliver the baby. And so that's the point that he's trying to make there, is that the labor pains are there. The baby is ready to be born, and yet there is no strength. There's nothing left. And so he just didn't have any more human strength to expel the enemy at all. And so Hezekiah confessed that he deserved the crisis that had overtaken, because, he had basically got them into that position, and but he didn't appeal for divine help for his own self, for his own needs, for his own personal deliverance. But he said we need divine help because of the Lord's honor and the needs of his people. He's more concerned about the reputation of God than he was about his own personal well-being. And also he was concerned about the needs of the people. So, Hezekiah, he's a good king at this point, and so he's not particularly looking out for himself in this regard. He's trying to do what's right. And so he appealed for Isaiah to pray on behalf of the remaining Judahites who had not already been devoured by the Assyrians. Remember, the Assyrians they'd gone to Lachish, they're now at Libnah, and they had already gone to many of these cities, and there's almost nothing left for the Assyrians to conquer other than Jerusalem itself. And so, unfortunately, Hezekiah had waited until there were no more options left. And, had he gone to the Lord right at the very beginning, then the people in the countryside in these other places, Lachish and Libnah and so forth, would not have had to suffer from being captured and then carried off by the Assyrians or killed, either way. So he said, when the officials of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, "Thus you will say to your master, thus says Adonai, do not be afraid of the words you have heard, with which the boys of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I am putting a spirit in him so that he will hear a rumor and will return to his own country. Then I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land." All right, so the officials came to Isaiah, and then Isaiah responded by sending them right back to the king with a message from God. Hezekiah was not to be fearful of the blasphemous claims of Sennacherib's underlings. And notice where it doesn't say the mighty warriors of Sennacherib. He says, no, the boys. He says, don't be afraid of these boys. How did they say that? Do not be afraid of the words which you have heard, with which the boys of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. So God's not even looking at these guys as worthy opponents, because obviously they're not. And he said, so that there's going to be a rumor or something. God is in control. So he's going to put a spirit, or he's going to talk into the spirit of Sennacherib. And a rumor or something is going to start playing on his mind. And basically, Hezekiah and Judah and God are going to be living rent-free in Sennacherib's brain for a little while. And he's going to pack up and leave. Now, there is some confusion. I don't know if it's confusion or just disagreement with all the historians and the commentators about, okay, did he leave Libnah and then come back later to try to surround Jerusalem? Or is all of this part of the same story and the same events? And there are arguments either way. Both ways there are arguments as to whether he left because he heard that the king of Ethiopia, who would eventually become the king of Egypt, was coming up that direction and was going to fight against him, and perhaps he had been out in the field long enough that his supply train was weakened or whatever, and he just didn't want to fight against this Ethiopian king. Because remember now, the Ethiopians had a reputation for being fairly fierce warriors, as did the Assyrians. And so it would have been bloody either way. And so he said that God says, Sennacherib is going to go home and he will be killed at home. So when he goes home, he's not coming back and he will be killed. Now, then verse 8 says, then the Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria fighting against Libnah, for he had heard he had withdrawn from Lachish. Now he had heard them saying concerning Tirhakah, the king of Ethiopia, saying, he has come to fight against you. All right, now, the Rabshakeh returned to his master, and because, he learned Hezekiah was not going to surrender. So actually, he's about 5 miles closer to Jerusalem than when he was at Lachish. And if we have the correct place of where Libnah is, we don't really know. There's a couple of candidates for where Libnah was, and they've done the digging and so forth, and so again, there's a couple of opinions and beliefs by the archaeologists as where Libnah was, but they say it's about 5 miles closer to Jerusalem than when he was at Lachish. And so the message that Tirhakah, the king of Ethiopia, was about to come up and engage him in battle. Okay, Sennacherib decided, okay, we're gonna terminate further campaigns in the Palestine area, Judah, temporarily. We're gonna go home, and so at this time, this Ethiopian king Tirhakah was about 20 years old, and he did not actually accede to the throne of Egypt and Ethiopia until about 690 BC. So that would have been another 11 years. So he would have been about 30, 31 years old when he acceded to the throne of Egypt. So at any rate, Sennacherib did not want to do battle with the guy now. And so in terms of, calling this guy the king of Ethiopia or whatever, they frequently in those days, in writing the history afterwards, would refer to a person by their final title, or however high they rose to, and for us, we would talk about General Ulysses S. Grant on the battlefield in the Civil War. We wouldn't talk about President Ulysses S. Grant leading the Union Army on the battlefield in the Civil War. No, we would call him as to what their rank was at the time of the battle. Not so with the ancient writers. So anyway, there's some confusion. Did he withdraw all the troops? That's a lot of baggage and a lot of effort to move his army back home and then come back later on. But anyway, it says, it goes on in verse 9, the second half of verse 9. When he heard it, we're talking about this king of Ethiopia, when he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah, and also it could have been when he heard that Hezekiah was not going to surrender. He said, thus you will say to King Hezekiah of Judah, saying, do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you, saying, Jerusalem will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, utterly destroying them. So will you be delivered? Have the gods of the nations delivered those my fathers destroyed? It goes on, Haran, Rezeph, or the children of Eden, who were at Telasar. Where is the king of Hamath, or the king of Arpad, or the king of the city of Sepharvaim of Henna or Eva. So he's listing a number of nations that they've already conquered there. Sennacherib warned Hezekiah that through these, the messengers and a letter there, not to let the messages from Adonai deceive him into thinking that Jerusalem would survive. And so, because after all the lands that the Assyrian kings before Sennacherib had come against, they'd conquered them all. They'd invaded them. They went through Israel, the 10 northern tribes, like a hot knife through butter, and captured Samaria, and it fell, in relatively short time. And so none of the powerful cities of that upper Euphrates area received help to overcome Assyria from their own, national gods. Remember, each country, each people group had their own local deities that they would pray to. And so Sennacherib is saying, hey, none of those gods could stand up against me. And so your God is just one of the other gods. I mean, it's no big deal to me. You will fall just like the other ones did. And so that was his taunt to Hezekiah. So then verse 14, then Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. Then Hezekiah went up to the house of Adonai and spread it before Adonai. Hezekiah prayed to Adonai, saying, okay, so when Hezekiah got the letter from Sennacherib, he looked it over and he says, all right, I'm going to the temple with this. And he just laid it all out. Now, where he laid it out, I don't know if he laid it out on some table or where there may have been something that he could put this letter out there. And but whatever it was, however it was, he brought it to the Lord just like he should have all along. And so he brought it out there, but more importantly than just taking it to the temple, he took it to the Lord and then he prayed. Very important. And this was his prayer. Adonai Svaot, God of Israel, who is enthroned upon the cherubim, you alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, Adonai, and hear. Open your eyes, Adonai, and see. Listen to all the words of Sennacherib, who was sent to mock the living God. It is true, Adonai, the kings of Assyria have devastated all the countries and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were not gods, but the works of human hands, wood and stone. So they have destroyed them. Now, Adonai, our God, save us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are Adonai. So, and I forgot to put that out there. Okay. Anyway, Hezekiah began his prayer by acknowledging the Lord's uniqueness. Adonai was not like the gods of the nations, but the only true God who dwelt there among his people. Right there, he was still, the Ark of the Covenant was still in place in the temple, and God's presence was there over the mercy seat in that temple. And so he's acknowledging this is the Creator who rules and determines everything. And so I guess you would say that theologically and thematically, this confession ends the first part of the book of Isaiah. And Hezekiah asked the Lord of hosts, God Almighty, to pay attention to those blasphemies of the Assyrian king. He acknowledged the Assyrian superiority over all the other nations. He said, yeah, it's true. They've overrun everybody they've come against. But But he said that's because their gods are only gods of wood and stone. Theirs is not the living God. And so he asked the Lord to deliver Jerusalem so the nations would know that the Lord alone was God. In short, he prayed for the glory of God. Now, in Hezekiah's prayer, it's the theme, the overarching main character in Hezekiah's prayer is God himself. And so it's all about the character of God and who he is, his honor, his uniqueness, and the revelation of his glory before the world. So this prayer was not particularly a petition for relief for Jerusalem, but it was more of an announcement of God and who he is. So anyway, let me get to this chat here. Verse 16, an appeal to God who is merciful. Yes. Let me pull that down, and we'll pull that back up again. Just sit. Yes, God of Israel, who is enthroned upon the cherubim, you alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. This is not unlike normative Jewish prayers. When you have there's actually three parts of a traditional Jewish prayer. One of them being at the beginning of it is proclamation that you are God, you are above all else, and there is none other like you. The words of that effect. The second part of the prayer is petition. So you've had proclamation, then you have petition. You're telling God what it is that you need, what you want. And then the third part of it is acknowledging God and his greatness in praise. And you're praising God for what he has done, what he's going to do now, or, what he's doing now for you, what he's going to do for you in the future. And so you have the proclamation, petition, and praise, those three things in a normative traditional Jewish prayer. And so we can see that this part of his prayer was that first part, the proclamation. So all right, then we get into verse 21. And I had a lot of words in here tonight, and it looks like I'm gonna, who knows, I might even finish out before 8 o'clock tonight. Then Isaiah, son of Amos, sent word to Hezekiah saying, thus says Adonai, the God of Israel, because you prayed to me about King Sennacherib of Assyria, this is the word that Adonai has spoken about him. The virgin daughter of Zion will despise you and mock you. The daughter of Jerusalem will shake her head at you. All right, so the Lord explained that it was Hezekiah's trust in him expressed in his prayer that led to his receiving the information about what God was just about to do. Hezekiah would see the Lord's hand at work more clearly because he had prayed. Assyria had mocked the Lord's virgin daughter. That is a reference to Jerusalem, who was especially dear to him. Jerusalem was like a virgin in that no foreign foe had penetrated Jerusalem. They'd never broken through the walls or had violated it. Assyria had basically incurred his anger by mocking Jerusalem. And you can think of God getting very angry over this whole thing in terms of a father whose daughter was assaulted, and just assaulted, but it was close. And so how angry would any father be at some kind of an assault like that? And so this is what God is doing here. The Assyria had come up, and they are assaulting Judah. They surrounded everything around Jerusalem, and they had taken, Judah had basically fallen, other than Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is the prize. But they had not been able to defeat Jerusalem. They hadn't even able to come against it yet, and God is angry with that. And so, very understandable if you put it in human terms about if you had a young daughter that again was assaulted, but they not consummated, or not the rape was not complete, just an assault. Well, for me, it would make no difference. I would my blood would boil, and I would be wanting to exact retribution. And so God was in that kind of a mood. Says, whom did you taunt and blaspheme? Against whom did you raise your voice and haughtily lift your eyes? Against the Holy One of Israel. So this is God speaking again. Sennacherib, who was he going up against? He was bad mouthing. Okay, so the Judahites, the people of Jerusalem, but no, he was mocking and taunting and blaspheming the very essence, or the very person, the personhood of God. If you could, I struggle with that word there in the outline. I didn't know exactly how to say that where it made sense, that they were going against God, who he is, his character, everything about him, his essence. And raised up all of this mocking language and everything. Remember, we've seen this before. What does God hate? He hates a haughty person. He doesn't like somebody that's arrogant and haughty. And so here Sennacherib is the very personification of arrogant and haughty. And so God said, okay, you came against me. I personally now am going to come against you. And it's not going to be that God is going to send another army from Egypt or Babylon or wherever to come in and conquer Sennacherib's army. We'll see how he does that in just a little bit. So it was God himself who was attacked and mocked by Sennacherib. So now it's going to be God himself who exacts punishment on Sennacherib. All right. So verses 24 here. Through your servants you have blasphemed my Lord, and said, with my many chariots I have climbed to the heights of the mountains, to the remotest parts of Lebanon. I cut down its tall cedars and choice cypress trees. I have gone to its farthest peaks, its thick forest. I dug and drank water. With the sole of my feet, I dried up all the streams of Egypt. All right. That's pretty rowdy talk there. Assyria's sin, I think we could say it's their failure to recognize that it wasn't them. It was God's hands that shaped their fortunes. Assyria, said that they thought that it was their own might, their chariots, their horsemen, their infantry, and so forth. That was what was responsible for all these victories, and that she had gained all of this power and all this territory because they were just very fierce and great warriors. And they were. There's no doubt about that. They were terrorist warriors, and they were very, very successful. But they considered themselves omnipotent, rather than acknowledging that it was Hashem, it was Adonai, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that was omnipotent, not themselves. It was God alone. And so these verses here that, God is saying, well, this is what you're saying here. They read very much like a lot of the Assyrian annals that archaeologists have found and translated, that these kings boast about their conquests, and they never acknowledged any failures. They only talked about their conquests. So Assyria's rulers never did acknowledge that it was God who gave them this power and success in their battles. God goes on and says, have you not heard? I did it long ago. From ancient times I planned it. Now I have brought it to pass that you should turn fortified cities into heaps of rubble. Their inhabitants are weak-handed, shattered, and ashamed. They're like the grass of the field and the green herb, like grasses on roofs, scorched before it has grown up. All right, so God said, haven't you heard? Don't you understand? Assyria had not heard the truth. They were not looking for the truth. They lacked that divine revelation that helps people see the realities of life, what is really real. It was the Lord and not the Assyrians who was responsible for all of the Assyrian conquest. He not only planned it long ago. Remember, God is he's omnipotent. He knows everything. He's everywhere. He sees everything, and he's all powerful. So he had planned this all along, long ago, because he knew how men would react. And so he brought all of this stuff to pass. And part of it was that he had used Assyria to punish Israel. No doubt about it, because God said he was going to do that. And then now he's going to take Assyria out of the picture, but not with another army right now, and certainly not in the Levant, in the territory of Israel and Judah and the near Middle East. They were going to leave that area and never come back. They would be defeated by the Babylonians before they could ever come back and do dangerous things in Israel ever again. So all of this, that's why Assyria, they were able to subdue all of the enemies and take over the territories. Why? Because God allowed it and he ordained it. God was the real sovereign, not these strong nations that time to time come in and conquer people around. That's what God allows for his own purposes. Why does he do that? Sometimes it's for judgment. Sometimes we don't know the answer. It's all part of his plan. But he says, but I know you're sitting down, you're going out, you're coming in, and you're raging against me, because you're raging against me and your arrogance reached my ears, and I will put my hook in your nose and my bridle in your lips, and I will turn you back by the way that you came. All right, now this is pretty graphic language here. The Lord knew everything about the Assyrians, including their raging against himself. And because they raged against God and felt complacent, I guess, about controlling their own destiny, he was going to teach them a lesson in who is the real sovereign. He would lead them away as they led prisoners that they had taken captive in war. They put hooks in their noses. Sometimes they would put a hook in their jaw. And we have pictures of Assyrian monuments that pictures the Assyrians doing just that. And let me see if I can show you a picture. Yeah, here's a drawing from a bas relief, that carving of what they are doing to the prisoners, torturing them. In this case right here, pouring molten metal into a person's mouth, blinding them. They've got hooks in their nose or in their lips or in their, in their jaws or whatever. The Assyrians, like I said, were very, very cruel people. And that was the way that they did, handcuffs they didn't have so much handcuffs. They would stick that hook in them, and it would be very hard for somebody to pull away. Especially sometimes they would put the hooks through the mouth, down around, and come out the bottom of the jaw. So there's really no way that person could ever break away from that without somehow cutting the barbs off of the hook. Pretty cruel stuff. So this shall be a sign to you. This year you will eat what grows by itself, and the second year what springs from that. But in the third year you will sow, reap, and plant vineyards and eat their fruit. The surviving remnant of the house of Judah will take root downward and bear fruit upward. For from Jerusalem a remnant will go out, and survivors from Mount Zion. The zeal of Adonai Zvaot shall perform this. All right, so the sign that God was giving him was that for 2 years, normal agriculture would be impossible around Jerusalem. Why? Sennacherib had just completely devastated the countryside. But God would cause the land to produce enough to sustain the inhabitants, just enough. Probably the 2 years of interruption, like I said, resulted from Assyrian military activity, and because they're just going to go through there and take whatever they wanted, and they would just destroy crops or just gather it all in and not have anything for the people. And so fruitfulness in various forms has always been God's blessings on those who trust him. If you trust him, he's going to make you fruitful and multiply. So it says, and then in the third year, planting and harvesting as usual would resume. It was particularly unusual that the Judahites would be able to plant vineyards and eat their fruit shortly after that, because it took several years for new grapevines to yield a crop. But supernaturally, they're gonna plant these vineyards and orchards and so forth, and God was supernaturally going to bring them to fruiting in a very, very short period of time. Perhaps they had planted the vineyards as soon as Sennacherib left, but it would still take years, 7 or 8 years, before they would have grapes that would produce enough for wine and so forth. But God said, nope. You're going to have them on that third year. You're going to have a crop, and it's going to be back to agriculture as normal. So said the surviving remnant of the Judahites, those that were not killed off in the countryside, would increase in number and become stronger, like the plants just mentioned. So God was going to bless the people. They were going to have lots of babies, and they were going to be healthy babies. They're going to grow up and be strong, and so they would be secure and they would prosper. The Lord promised to preserve a people for himself from among the people of Jerusalem, and this would include the Davidic line of kings. He had promised that earlier. We could read that in 2 Samuel 7, and even back in Isaiah 9:6. His own zeal to remain true to his word and to bless his people would perform all of this, and it would not depend on the faithfulness of his people, but on his faithfulness, because we see later on that the people kind of fell back into their old ways, and that's why 100 years later, or 586, then is when Jerusalem fell. So, and all of this blessing, the real reason for the blessing, God and God alone, no other. All right, Verse 33. Therefore, thus says Adonai concerning the king of Assyria, he will not come to the city or shoot an arrow there, or come before it with a shield, or throw up a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, by the same he will return, and he will not come into the city. It is a declaration of Adonai, for I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. So the Lord promised Hezekiah in closing that Sennacherib would not even besiege Jerusalem, let alone attack it, either from close range or from far away. He would instead return to his own land the same way he had come. Now, there was a prism. I had a picture of it last week or the week before, whenever Taylor's prism or the Sennacherib prism that Sennacherib claimed to have shut Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage, but it was really God who protected Hezekiah. God would defend Jerusalem and preserve it. But he said, not so much for the sake of Hezekiah or even for the people there. There would be a remnant that would be saved, but he's not doing it for that. He says, I'm doing it because this is my city. It's for my reputation. And these guys insulted me and said that they would take over because I'm not powerful enough to protect Jerusalem. Well, I'll show them. And so there again, God is saying, for my own reputation, and because I made a promise many years ago, 400 years earlier, that for David's sake, he was going to have an everlasting dynasty. And of course, we know that there's an interruption, but that there will be an everlasting dynasty that culminates when Messiah comes back to the earth and we begin that millennial reign. And that's going to be quite a thing to see, I promise you. All right, then the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. When the men arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. Isaiah had predicted that God would break Assyria's power in the promised land. That he had said that back in chapter 14, I believe. Then this short section records how he miraculously fulfilled that promise. The divine act of basically, it's just massive proportions. It basically settled the issue of Assyria's fate, and it provided a very vivid demonstration that it is God who controls world history. It's not rulers and potentates and dictators and so forth. He will always fulfill his promises. God, he is not a man that he should lie. He's always going to do what he says he's going to do. And so the literal fulfillment of these near prophecies then should encourage us then to look for a literal fulfillment of Isaiah's far distant prophecies. God said he's going to do this now, here and now, and he did it. So when God says, okay, in the future, I'm going to do thus and so, we should also be aware that God is still on the throne and he's going. What happened there? Let me get back to this. The Lord, it said the Lord himself slew 185,000 of the Assyrian soldiers in one night. Okay, without God, that would have been impossible. It just could not have happened. So it said it was the angel of the Lord. Now where have we heard that angel of the Lord before? In Egypt. When the angel of the Lord came through and it was, and slaughtered all the firstborn, that they didn't have the blood over the door. We don't know. The angel of the Lord may have been the pre-incarnate Messiah, since he is identified as the Lord. But it could very well have been that. I know in our Passover Seders, part of what we write or read in our Passover Seders, that it was the Lord himself, not an angel, that came through and killed all the firstborn. All right, so anyway, some scholars think that the angel of the Lord was an angel whom the Lord sent, who was intimately identified with the Lord in the Old Testament, because he represented the Lord, somebody like a Gabriel or a Michael or something like that. So we just don't know, and it could very well have been a pre-incarnate Messiah. We don't know. But when he says he struck them, that kind of implies a disease. And Sennacherib had sent a messenger to intimidate Hezekiah's people. And so, ironically, then the Lord responded by sending a messenger, the angel of the Lord, to destroy Sennacherib's army. And so it's kind of interesting if you ever read let's see, Lord Byron, the poet. He wrote a thing called The Destruction of Sennacherib, and then George Robinson, he reproduced that, and kind of interesting reading. Herodotus wrote that mice caused a disease that spread among the Assyrian army. Well, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, how the mechanism of it, it could have been just that God went through there and said, you're not going to be breathing anymore. You're all going to have heart attacks. Who knows how it happened, but it happened. All right. So verse 37 and 38. So King Sennacherib of Assyria withdrew and returned home and stayed in Nineveh. It also came to pass, as he was worshiping in the house of his god Nisroch, that his sons Adramelech and Sarezer struck him down with the sword and escaped into the land of Ararat, up in Turkey. Then his son Esarhaddon became the king in his place. So Sennacherib, the great king of Assyria, he returned to Assyria, and he had lost a large part of his army. And then on top of that, he had heard the rumor of the advancing Ethiopian ruler. He just tucked tail and headed home. Now, he lived in Nineveh for another 20 years before he died. And he conducted other military campaigns, in other parts of the world and other parts of his empire. But never again did he come back down into the environs of Israel, Judah, the Levant, as it's sometimes called. A lot of times, some people will call it Palestine. I just almost entirely reject that name and don't call it Palestine. I'll do a circumlocution, because God didn't give it that name; the Romans did. And people use it today that inappropriately. And so anyway, they never came back down into that area of the world. And so we know that it was ironic that while he was worshiping in the temple of his idol in Nineveh, God effected Sennacherib's assassination, whereas it was while worshiping the true God in his temple in Jerusalem that God moved to spare Hezekiah's life. So, Hezekiah went into the house of the Lord and got help. Sennacherib went to the house of his little g god and got killed. So the Babylonian royal chronicles recorded the assassination of Sennacherib and the accession of Esarhaddon in 681 BCE. And so it was just not the way of the Assyrians to record a national disaster like the two sons killing the emperor. So it's understandable then that archaeologists did not find the record of Sennacherib being killed in something that was in Assyria. It had to come from the Babylonians. All right. So anyway, that concludes the class for tonight. And are there any comments or questions that someone may have as we conclude this tonight?